There are houses that hold secrets the way old wood holds water, slowly, silently, until the pressure becomes too great and everything gives way at once. The house at the corner of a narrow Manhattan street had stood for nearly 2 centuries, its brownstone facade worn smooth by time, its windows clouded with the kind of grime that accumulates not over years but over generations. Neighbors passed it every morning without a second glance. Children dared each other to ring its bell. A city inspector had filed 3 reports about its deteriorating foundation and forgotten about all 3. Nobody truly looked at it. Nobody truly wondered. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable part of this story, that the secret it held survived not because it was carefully protected, but because an entire city had simply stopped paying attention. In the spring of 2017, a routine demolition crew began the process of clearing the property to make way for yet another luxury development. Manhattan has a long history of eating its own past in the name of progress, and this block was no exception. The crew was experienced, efficient, and entirely unprepared for what they found when they broke through the basement floor. Beneath a layer of concrete that had been poured sometime in the mid-20th century, beneath the rubble and the dust and the indifferent weight of 200 years, they found a passage. Not a crawl space, not a forgotten utility tunnel, a deliberate, carefully constructed underground passage, roughly 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, lined with hand-cut stone and sealed at both ends with doors that had been nailed shut from the outside. The wood of those doors had decayed to the point of fragility, but their iron hinges, hand-forged and remarkably preserved, still held their shape with a kind of stubborn dignity. I want you to pause for a moment and truly imagine what that discovery felt like. Picture the dust hanging in the air. Picture the light from a single work lamp casting long shadows down a tunnel that no living person had entered in nearly 2 centuries. Picture the silence. The deep, specific silence of a space that has been sealed and forgotten. And then picture the moment when one of the workers, stepping carefully forward, raised his flashlight and saw, carved into the stone of the far wall, a single phrase in neat, deliberate letters: "The Lord will provide passage." That phrase changed everything. What followed was one of the most significant historical discoveries in New York City in recent memory. A story that stretched back to 1832, to a network of brave and desperate people who risked everything in the service of human freedom, and to a house that kept their secret long after every one of them had turned to dust. This is the story of the secret underground railroad passage hidden beneath a Manhattan brownstone, and I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to these words, because what you are about to hear deserves a witness.
To understand what was found beneath that house, you first have to understand what New York City was in 1832. We have a tendency, a comfortable, convenient tendency, to divide the pre-Civil War United States into a simple moral geography, the slave-holding South on one side, the free and righteous North on the other. But history has never been that clean, and New York City in the early 19th century is one of the most complicated examples of that messiness. New York had formally abolished slavery in 1827, just 5 years before the events at the heart of this story. But abolition on paper and abolition in practice were 2 very different things in a city whose economy was deeply and deliberately entangled with Southern cotton, Southern tobacco, and Southern money. The merchants of Lower Manhattan did not grow cotton. They financed it, they insured it, they shipped it, they sold the goods that Southern plantations needed to function, and they profited enormously from a system of labor they had technically, legally, officially renounced. New York banks held mortgages on Southern plantations. New York insurers wrote policies on enslaved human beings as though they were livestock. New York newspapers ran advertisements placed by Southern slaveholders seeking the return of people who had escaped. The city was free in name and complicit in practice. and that contradiction created a landscape of extraordinary danger for any black person, free or escaped, who moved through its streets. The Fugitive Slave Act, which would be strengthened dramatically in 1850, already had an earlier form in 1793 that gave slaveholders and their agents the legal right to cross state lines and reclaim escaped people. In New York City, this meant that a man or woman who had walked hundreds of miles to freedom could be seized on a Manhattan street, stripped of any claim to liberty, and transported back to the South with minimal legal recourse. There were corrupt officials who cooperated with Southern agents. There were professional slave catchers who operated openly in the city, and there was an entire ecosystem of fear that surrounded black New Yorkers, free and escaped alike, that has largely been edited out of the romantic story we tell ourselves about the North. Into this landscape, in the late 1820s and early 1830s, stepped a network of people, black and white, Quaker and Methodist, wealthy merchant and impoverished dock worker, who had decided that the law was wrong, and they would simply ignore it. They called themselves, in their private correspondence, by no grand name. They were neighbors helping neighbors. They were people of faith acting on faith. They were, in the language of a later generation, conductors on the Underground Railroad, a network that was not underground in the literal sense, and not a railroad at all, but a chain of safe houses, secret routes, and extraordinary courage that helped thousands of enslaved people reach freedom in the years before the Civil War. The house at the corner of that Manhattan street belonged in 1832 to a man named Amos Whitfield.
Amos Whitfield was not the kind of man history tends to remember. He left behind no portraits, no published memoirs, no speeches that were transcribed and bound in leather and placed in university libraries. What he left behind were records, the quiet, unglamorous records of a life lived in careful, deliberate obscurity. A property deed from 1829, an entry in a church registry from 1831, a single letter discovered in a Quaker archive in Philadelphia in the 1990s and largely overlooked until the 2017 excavation brought researchers back to it with new urgency. In that letter, written in a precise and unhurried hand, Whitfield described his house as a place where the weary may rest without fear of the morning. At the time the letter was catalogued, the archivist had noted it as a likely reference to the Christian concept of sanctuary. After 2017, nobody read it that way anymore. Whitfield was a free black man, born in Philadelphia in approximately 1791, who had made his way to New York City sometime around 1820. He was a carpenter by trade, skilled, sought after, and possessed of the kind of practical intelligence that colonial and post-colonial America reserved its limited respect for, regardless of a man's race, provided he was useful enough. He built furniture for wealthy households in Lower Manhattan. He repaired the interiors of churches. He was, by every account that survives, a man who knew how to make himself indispensable to people who held power, and who used that indispensability with extraordinary strategic care. By 1829, he had saved enough to purchase the brownstone property that would become the center of this story. It was not a grand purchase. The building was already aging, situated in a neighborhood that wealthier New Yorkers were beginning to abandon in favor of addresses further uptown. But Whitfield was not buying prestige. He was buying walls. He was buying a basement. He was buying the specific architectural privacy that a man with a plan requires, and he was buying it in a neighborhood where the foot traffic was heavy enough that one more black man entering and leaving a building would attract no particular attention. What researchers pieced together after 2017, working from the physical evidence of the passage itself, from Whitfield's surviving letter, from Quaker network records in Philadelphia and New York, and from two extraordinary documents discovered sealed inside a tin box in the wall of the passage, was a picture of a man who had been planning this for years. The passage had not been dug in secret during a single desperate night. It had been constructed methodically over a period that archaeologists estimated at between 2 and 4 years, using the same hand-cut stone techniques that appear in Whitfield's documented carpentry and masonry work from the same period. He had not hired it out. The dimensions, the tool marks, the specific way the stone had been fitted, all of it bore the signature of a single craftsman working alone or nearly alone in the hours before dawn and after dark, in the basement of a house that the neighbors assumed was simply being renovated. The passage ran approximately 60 feet from the basement of Whitfield's brownstone to a point beneath the rear yard of an adjacent property, a property that, in 1832, was owned by a Quaker merchant named Samuel Carey. Carey's name appears in Philadelphia Quaker abolitionist records as early as 1825.
He was a documented member of the New York Manumission Society, an organization that had been working toward the legal abolition of slavery in New York since 1785. He was, in the careful language of that era's activist correspondents, a friend to the cause. Whether Carey knew from the beginning that Whitefield was digging beneath his yard, or whether he discovered it and chose silence, is a question the historical record cannot definitively answer. What the record does show is that the two men knew each other, that they worshipped at the same church on at least 3 documented occasions, and that when Carey sold his property in 1841, 9 years after the events at the center of this story, he sold it with a clause, buried in the legal language of the deed, that required the new owner to maintain the integrity of the subsurface structures. A lawyer in 1841 reviewing that clause would have found it unremarkable, a standard protection against the kind of foundation damage common in Manhattan's waterlogged soil. A historian in 2018, reading it in light of the excavation, found it remarkable indeed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We need to go back to 1832, to the specific months between February and November of that year, because that is when the passage was used, actively, urgently, at enormous personal risk, for the purpose for which it had been built. The winter of 1831 into 1832 had been brutal in New York. The harbor had frozen in January, cutting off shipping and throwing dock workers out of employment. The city was crowded, tense, and economically strained in the way that cities become when the cold lasts too long and the money runs short. It was also, for the free black community of Lower Manhattan, a period of heightened danger. A series of highly publicized cases in late 1831, in which black men and women with legitimate claims to freedom had been seized by Southern agents and transported south before their cases could be heard in court, had sent a current of terror through the community that no amount of official reassurance could quiet. The law was not protecting them. Everyone knew it. The question was what, if anything, could be done. Into this climate of fear came a man whose name appears in the historical record only as Thomas, no surname. In the tin box discovered in the wall of the passage, among the documents that researchers would spend months carefully preserving and analyzing, was a brief account written in Whitefield's hand that described the arrival of a man called Thomas from a plantation in Virginia, bearing wounds upon his wrists consistent with recent restraint, speaking little but understanding everything, and requiring above all things a period of safety before the continuation of his journey. Thomas had traveled, by Whitefield's account, for 19 days. He had walked at night and hidden during the day. He had eaten what he could find and drunk from streams, and avoided every road that carried regular traffic. He arrived at Whitefield's door in February of 1832 in a condition that Whitefield described, with the precise and unsentimental language of a man who had seen it before, as alive, but barely so. Thomas was the first. He would not be the last.
The question that historians find themselves returning to again and again when they study the Underground Railroad is not the question that gets asked in textbooks. The textbooks ask about routes and numbers, how many people escaped, which cities served as waypoints, which famous conductors shepherded the most freedom seekers to safety. Those are important questions. But the question that keeps researchers awake, the question that the physical evidence of a passage like Whitefield's forces into sharp and uncomfortable focus, is simpler and more human than any of that. It is this: what did it actually feel like to hide someone in your house, knowing that the law considered that person property, knowing that discovery meant not just the destruction of everything you had built, but potentially the end of your freedom or your life, and choosing to do it anyway? Amos Whitefield was a free black man in a city that had abolished slavery 5 years earlier. He had legal standing. He had property. He had a reputation built over more than a decade of skilled work and careful conduct. He had, in other words, everything that a black man in 1832 America could reasonably hope to accumulate, and every single piece of it was at risk the moment Thomas crossed his threshold. The Fugitive Slave Act did not only threaten escaped people, it threatened those who harbored them.
A conviction for harboring a fugitive slave could result in fines that would bankrupt a man of Whitfield's modest means, and in a legal climate where black testimony was routinely dismissed and white accusation routinely credited, the bar for conviction was disturbingly low. Whitfield knew this. The letter in the Philadelphia archive, written sometime in late 1832 or early 1833, makes clear that he understood the risk with complete clarity. He wrote, in a passage that researchers have returned to repeatedly for its quiet, devastating honesty, "I am not a brave man by nature. I am a frightened man who has decided that fear is insufficient reason to do nothing." That sentence deserves to be read slowly. A frightened man who has decided that fear is insufficient reason to do nothing. There is no heroic self-mythology in it, no claim to righteousness or courage. There is only the plain acknowledgement of a man who looked at his fear and looked at another human being's suffering and made a calculation that history would eventually, inadequately, call courage.
Thomas stayed in the hidden space beneath Whitfield's basement for 11 days. The passage itself, as researchers reconstructed it, was not designed primarily as a transit route. The 60 feet of tunnel connecting to Carey's property was the exit, the emergency escape. The primary hiding space was a chamber, roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, carved into the earth at the midpoint of the passage and reinforced with stone on all 4 walls and the ceiling. It was, in the cold language of archaeology, a subterranean room. In the warmer language of what it actually was, it was a sanctuary. It had been furnished with minimal but deliberate care. A wooden platform raised off the earthen floor to guard against moisture, a single oil lamp with a carefully shielded flame to prevent light from escaping through the basement above, and a supply of food and water that Whitfield replenished each night through a carefully concealed access point in the basement floor. The 2 documents found in the tin box in the passage wall gave researchers a window into what those 11 days were like. The first document was a brief journal, written in pencil on paper that had been carefully folded to fit inside the tin, in a handwriting that was not Whitfield's, smaller, more irregular, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write under difficult circumstances and who had not had many opportunities to practice. Researchers attributed it, with reasonable confidence, to Thomas himself. It covered 9 of the 11 days, and it was not a document of grand emotion. It was a document of small, specific, human detail. The sound of footsteps above him in the house, the smell of food being cooked somewhere overhead, the way the lamp flame moved when someone opened the access point in the floor, the particular quality of silence in a sealed underground space that is, as Thomas wrote in a phrase that stopped every researcher who read it cold, a silence that is not empty, but full of everything I am trying not to think about. He wrote about Virginia. Not in detail. The entries were brief, sometimes only 2 or 3 sentences, but with the specific gravity of a man processing something enormous in the only way available to him. He wrote about a woman whose name he gave only as M. He wrote about a child. He wrote on what appears to be the 7th day, a single sentence that stands alone on the page, with no context and no follow-up. I do not know if they are alive. And then on the next entry, he returned to the immediate and the practical, the food, the lamp, the footsteps, the silence, as though the only way to survive the enormity of that uncertainty was to anchor himself to the concrete reality of the present moment. The second document in the tin box was a list. It was written in Whitfield's hand, on a single sheet of paper that had been folded 4 times and sealed with wax before being placed in the tin. It was a list of names, 17 names in total, each accompanied by a date and, in most cases, a brief notation. The dates ran from February 1832 to October 1832. The notations were cryptic, a single letter in most cases, occasionally a word. Researchers spent considerable time decoding the system, cross-referencing with Quaker network records and the sparse documentation of other known Underground Railroad waypoints in the Northeast. What they eventually concluded was that the list represented 17 people
who had passed through Whitfield's Passage in those 9 months. 17 people who had rested in that underground chamber, eaten food that Whitfield had carried down through the concealed access point, and then, when the moment was right, when the agents and the catchers and the dangerous currents of a hostile city had shifted enough to allow it, continued north. Thomas was the first name on the list. The notation beside his name was a single word: continued. It was, in the context of everything that surrounded it, one of the most hopeful words in the entire archive. The route north from Whitfield's Passage ran, as far as researchers could reconstruct it, through Carey's property, and from there to a series of safe houses in the neighborhood of what is now Tribeca, then north through Greenwich Village, which was, in 1832, still a semi-rural area on the outskirts of the city proper, and eventually to a network of Quaker contacts in Westchester County who could arrange passage further north toward Albany, and beyond Albany toward Canada. It was not a fixed route in the way that a railroad has fixed tracks. It was more like water finding its way downhill, always moving in the same general direction, always seeking the path of least resistance, changing its specific course in response to obstacles that shifted constantly. A safe house that was reliable in March might be compromised by April. A contact who was trustworthy in the summer might be under surveillance by the fall. The people who operated these networks lived in a state of perpetual improvisation, and the miracle was not that the system worked perfectly, it didn't, but that it worked at all. What made Whitfield's contribution distinctive, what set the passage beneath his brownstone apart from the more common forms of Underground Railroad assistance, was the sheer physical permanence of what he had built. Most safe houses were simply houses, ordinary domestic spaces that were repurposed for hiding, that offered a spare room or a hidden corner, but nothing purpose-built. Whitfield had spent years constructing something that was specifically, architecturally designed to conceal human beings from people who wanted to find them. The chamber beneath his basement was not an improvisation. It was an engineering project, executed with the skill and patience of a master craftsman who had thought carefully about every detail: the height of the ceiling, the drainage of the floor, the placement of the ventilation gap that allowed breathable air to circulate without creating a visible opening at ground level. He had thought about what it would feel like to be inside that space, and he had built it accordingly. That attention to the human experience of hiding is, for many researchers, the most moving aspect of the physical evidence. The raised wooden platform, the shielded lamp, the careful resupply of food and water. These were not the decisions of a man running a covert operation with ruthless efficiency. They were the decisions of a man who understood that the people coming to him had already endured more than most human beings are ever asked to endure, and who believed that the specific quality of the shelter he offered mattered, that it was not enough to simply not be caught, that the people in his care deserved, insofar as he could provide it, something that felt like dignity.
There is a particular kind of courage that history struggles to name correctly. We have good words for the courage that announces itself: the courage of the battlefield, the courage of the public speech, the courage of the man who stands in front of a crowd and declares that he will not be moved. We celebrate that kind of courage because it is visible, because it produces images and moments and quotes that can be carved into stone and taught to children. But there is another kind of courage that works in the opposite direction, that makes itself invisible, that survives precisely because it leaves no record, that asks its practitioners to do the most dangerous thing imaginable, and then act as though nothing has happened at all. That is the courage of the Underground Railroad, and of all the forms it took, none required a more sustained and exhausting performance of normalcy than the courage required of the people who lived above the hiding places. Amos Whitfield went to work every morning. This is the detail that researchers keep returning to, the detail that, once you understand what was happening beneath his feet, becomes almost impossible to process. He went to work every morning. He accepted commissions. He delivered furniture. He attended church. He greeted his neighbors on the street with the careful, measured warmth of a man who understood that a free black man in 1832 Manhattan could not afford to be either too visible or too invisible.
that the correct posture was a kind of studied ordinariness, a persistent, deliberate performance of having nothing to hide. He did this while, beneath his basement floor, human beings were eating the food he had left them and trying not to make sounds, and waiting for the signal that meant it was safe to move. The psychological weight of that double life is something no historical document can fully capture, but the letter in the Philadelphia archive gives us glimpses. Whitefield wrote, in a passage that researchers believe dates to the summer of 1832, about the experience of conducting a normal conversation with a neighbor, a white merchant who lived 2 doors down, and who had, on this particular afternoon, stopped to discuss the weather and the state of the shipping trade, while knowing that there was a person hidden beneath the floor of his house. He did not describe this with drama. He described it with a kind of exhausted precision, the way a person describes something that has become familiar enough to be bearable, but never familiar enough to be comfortable. He wrote that the neighbor had talked for nearly 20 minutes, and that during those 20 minutes, he had, in some portion of his mind, been listening for sounds from below. A shift of weight, a cough, any sound that would carry through the wooden floor of the basement and up through the stone of the foundation and into the air of the street where the neighbor was standing. He heard nothing. He always heard nothing. The chamber was well built, but the listening never stopped. This is what the textbooks leave out, not the facts of the Underground Railroad. Those are documented well enough, if incompletely, but the texture of it, the way it felt to be inside it, the way the fear became a constant presence that you learned to carry rather than a crisis that you could resolve. Whitefield was not afraid in the way that a person is afraid during a single acute moment of danger. He was afraid in the way that a person is afraid when the danger is structural and permanent and woven into the fabric of every ordinary day. And he kept going anyway. He kept going for 9 months, through 17 names on a list, through an unknown number of close calls and narrow escapes that the historical record does not preserve, because the whole point was to leave no record.
By midsummer of 1832, the operation, and it had by this point become an operation in the fullest sense of the word, had developed a rhythm and a support structure that extended well beyond Whitefield and Carey. The Quaker network that fed people into and out of the passage had its own internal logic and its own hierarchy of trust, built on years of shared risk and shared conviction. There were people who served as initial contacts, free black dockworkers primarily, who had connections to the maritime routes that many escaped people used to reach New York from the south. There were people who served as intermediaries, who passed information about timing and numbers through a system of coded language embedded in ordinary commercial correspondence. And there were people at the far end of the network, in Westchester and Albany, and eventually across the border into Canada, who received the people that Whitefield's passage had sheltered and helped them begin the impossible task of building new lives in freedom. Among the 17 names on Whitefield's list, researchers have been able to trace the subsequent histories of 6 with reasonable confidence. The records are fragmentary and uncertain. Freedom seekers who had escaped slavery had powerful reasons to obscure their origins and their roots, and many of them changed their names upon reaching safety, making the documentary trail deliberately difficult to follow. But 6 names, cross-referenced with census records, church registries, and the remarkable collection of personal narratives compiled by abolitionist organizations in the 1840s and 1850s, yielded enough to construct partial pictures of lives continued. One of the 6 was a woman named Clara, who appears on Whitefield's list as the 4th name, dated to April 1832. The notation beside her name is different from the others. Instead of the single letter or word that accompanies most entries, Whitefield wrote 3 words, "with child, continued." Clara was pregnant when she passed through the passage. She had traveled by the account that researchers believe corresponds to her entry, a narrative published in 1849 under the name Clara Freeman, from a plantation in South Carolina, a journey of more than 1,000 miles that had taken her nearly 2 months, and that she had made for the final 3 weeks, while visibly pregnant and in the grip of a fear that she described in the published narrative as not the fear of being caught, though that fear was also present, but the fear of what would happen to my child if I failed. Clara Freeman's narrative, which was published as part of her collection of freedom seeker testimonies, and which had been catalogued in university archives for decades without anyone connecting it to the Manhattan Passage, described her time in what she called a stone room beneath a carpenter's house, in terms that made researchers catch their breath when they read them in the context of the excavation. She described the lamp. She described the raised wooden platform. She described the sound of the city above her, the carriages and the voices and the distant sound of ships on the river, coming down through the earth in a muffled, dreamy way, that she said made her feel, for the first time in as long as she could remember, that she was not in the world but beneath it, and therefore for a moment safe from it. Her child was born 6 weeks after she left the passage, in a safe house in Westchester County. She named him Amos. The deliberateness of that choice, naming a child after the man whose passage had sheltered her, is the kind of historical detail that arrives with the force of something much larger than itself. Clara Freeman never met Amos Whitfield again as far as the record shows. She had no way of knowing, in the Westchester safe house where she gave birth, whether the man whose floor she had slept beneath was still alive, still free, still running his quiet and terrifying operation beneath the streets of Lower Manhattan. She knew only what he had done for her, in those days underground, and she encoded her gratitude in the name of her son in the only way available to her, permanently, irrevocably, in the one record that no courthouse or archive or act of destruction could erase. Amos Freeman appears in the 1870 census as a carpenter living in Rochester, New York. He was 37 years old. He had a wife and 3 children. His occupation was listed, in the neat bureaucratic handwriting of the census taker, with a word that must have carried a particular resonance for anyone who knew the name he carried and the story behind it: carpenter. The passage, meanwhile, continued its work through the summer and into the fall of 1832. The 17th and final name on Whitfield's list is dated October 14th of that year. After that date, the list ends. The passage, as far as researchers can determine, was sealed sometime in late 1832 or early 1833. Sealed from the outside, the doors nailed shut, the access point in the basement floor covered with a layer of stone and mortar that would not be disturbed for nearly 2 centuries. Why it was sealed, and what happened to Whitfield in the months that followed, is a question that leads into one of the darkest chapters of the story.
The sealing of the passage was not a decision made in calm reflection. Every piece of physical evidence, every surviving document, every thread of the historical record that researchers were able to pull and follow in the months after the 2017 excavation points toward the same conclusion, that something happened in the fall of 1832 that forced Whitfield's hand, that turned a carefully managed operation into a crisis, and that ended 9 months of extraordinary work with a suddenness that the neat, orderly list of 17 names does not prepare you for. To understand what that something was, you have to understand the specific atmosphere of New York City in the autumn of 1832, because the city that Whitfield was navigating in October of that year was a fundamentally different and more dangerous place than the city he had begun his work in the previous February. The cholera epidemic of 1832 had arrived in New York in late June, carried by ships from Europe, and moving through the city's crowded neighborhoods with a speed and lethality that overwhelmed every attempt at containment. By the end of the summer, more than 3,000 New Yorkers had died. The wealthy had fled to the countryside. The poor had nowhere to go. The city's already strained social fabric had torn in ways that would take years to repair. And in the particular ecology of fear and suspicion that an epidemic creates, the Underground Railroad network that Whitfield depended on had been severely disrupted. Safe houses had been abandoned, contacts had died or disappeared. The Quaker network in Westchester, which had been the reliable northern terminus of the route from Whitfield's Passage, had lost 2 of its key members to the epidemic and had temporarily suspended its operations while it reorganized. This left Whitfield in an extraordinarily precarious position. The network that moved people through and out of his passage depended on timing, on the careful coordination of arrivals and departures that ensured no one stayed in the underground chamber longer than absolutely necessary. When the northern end of the network went silent, that timing collapsed. People who should have moved on in 3 or 4 days were staying for 10 or 12. The chamber, designed for short-term concealment, was being asked to function as something closer to permanent housing. And every additional day that a person remained beneath the floor of Whitfield's house was another day in which something could go wrong. Something went wrong in October.
The historical record is frustratingly incomplete on the specific details, but researchers have pieced together a probable sequence of events from 3 sources: a brief entry in a Quaker meeting record from November 1832, a property record from December of the same year, and a single notation in the margin of a legal document filed in the New York County Court Archives in early 1833. What these sources suggest, taken together, is that in mid-October 1832, someone reported Whitfield to the authorities. Not with certainty, the report, as reconstructed from the legal document, appears to have been a suspicion rather than a direct accusation, the kind of vague allegation that a hostile neighbor or a paid informant might file without specific evidence. But in the legal climate of 1832, a vague allegation against a free black man was sufficient to trigger a search. The search of Whitfield's property appears to have found nothing. The passage was well concealed, the access point in the basement floor covered, the chamber sealed and silent. Whatever or whoever had been inside it at the time of the search was either no longer there or sufficiently hidden to escape detection. The legal document records the search as having produced no evidence of unlawful activity, and the case, such as it was, appears to have been dropped. Whitfield was not arrested, he was not charged. On paper, he survived the incident without consequence. But the passage was sealed within weeks of the search, and Whitfield left New York City before the end of the year. The property deed records show that Whitfield sold the brownstone in December 1832, at a price that researchers have noted was significantly below its market value, the kind of price you accept when you need to sell quickly and cannot afford to negotiate. The buyer was a dry goods merchant with no known connection to the abolitionist network. The sale included no protective clause about subsurface structures. That precaution, which Carey would include in his own deed 9 years later, either had not yet occurred to Whitfield or was impossible to include without raising the questions he could no longer afford to have raised. The passage was simply sealed, buried, left to its silence, and sold along with the building above it to a man who almost certainly had no idea what he was buying.
Where Whitfield went after leaving New York is a question that took researchers nearly 2 years to answer with any confidence. The trail goes cold in New York in December 1832 and does not pick up again until a property record in Philadelphia from 1835, where an Amos Whitfield, carpenter, purchased a modest house in a free black neighborhood in the northern part of the city. Whether this is the same man cannot be proven with absolute certainty. Amos Whitfield was not an uncommon name among free black men of that era, many of whom took the names of biblical figures or of admired community members. But the convergence of details, the profession, the approximate age recorded in an 1840 census entry, the connection to Philadelphia Quaker networks that had been documented as early as 1832, makes the identification, in the judgment of the researchers who examined it most carefully, highly probable. If it is the same man, then Amos Whitfield lived in Philadelphia for at least another decade, continuing his carpentry work, attending a Quaker-affiliated church, and, if the Philadelphia Abolitionist Network records are read in light of what he had done in New York, almost certainly continuing, in whatever form was available to him, the work he had begun beneath the streets of Manhattan. He does not appear in the Philadelphia records after 1845. He left no will, no death record that researchers have been able to locate, no grave with his name on it in any of the cemeteries where free black Philadelphians of his era were typically buried. He disappeared from the documentary record the way he had always operated within it, quietly, deliberately, leaving behind just enough to be followed and not quite enough to be fully known. The brownstone above the sealed passage changed hands 7 more times between 1832 and the 20th century. None of the subsequent owners appear to have had any knowledge of what lay beneath the basement floor. The property records show no unusual renovations, no unexplained construction, no hint that any of the building's many inhabitants had ever discovered the concealed access point or the tunnel beyond it. At some point in the mid-20th century, researchers estimate the 1940s or 1950s based on the composition of the concrete. Someone poured a new basement floor over the old one, adding another layer of concealment to a secret that was already nearly impossible to find. The city kept growing around it. The neighborhood changed. The building aged. And the passage waited, in the particular patience of buried things, for someone to finally break through the floor. The 2 workers who first entered the passage in the spring of 2017 have both given interviews in the years since the discovery, and both of them describe the experience in terms that go beyond the ordinary vocabulary of construction work. One of them, a man named Derek Torres, who had been doing demolition work in Manhattan for 11 years,
said that the moment he stepped into the tunnel and raised his flashlight and saw the carved phrase on the far wall, he felt something that he struggled to put into words. Not fear exactly, not excitement exactly, but something that he eventually described as weight. Like the air in there was heavier than regular air, he said in a 2019 documentary about the discovery. Like it had more in it, like it remembered something. That description, like it remembered something, is not the language of archaeology or historiography. It is the language of a man trying to articulate an experience that the available vocabulary is not quite adequate to contain. But it is, in its way, more precise than anything a formal analysis could offer, because what was preserved in that passage was not just stone and wood and iron and the physical remnants of a hidden room. What was preserved was the specific human reality of what had happened there, the fear and the hope and the 11 days of Thomas's journal, and the lamp flame and the sound of the city coming down through the earth, and the woman who would name her son after the man whose floor she had slept beneath. All of it had been sealed in the dark for 185 years, and when the concrete broke and the light finally reached it, what came back out was not just history. It was something that had been waiting to be witnessed.
The process of excavating and preserving the passage took 14 months. This is a detail that tends to surprise people when they first hear it. 14 months for 60 feet of tunnel, for a chamber roughly the size of a modest bedroom, for a tin box and 2 documents, and a carved phrase on a stone wall. But archaeological preservation at this level of historical significance is not demolition work run in reverse. It is something closer to surgery, slow, deliberate, conducted with instruments calibrated for delicacy rather than speed, by people who understand that the object of their work is not just the physical material in front of them, but the meaning embedded in every detail of how that material was arranged, positioned, and left. The way a stone was placed tells you something. The way a door was sealed tells you something. The angle of a tool mark in the wall tells you something. You do not rush through something that tells you this much. The team that conducted the preservation work was assembled by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission in collaboration with Columbia University's Archaeology Department, and a specialist in 19th century African American material culture, whose name, Dr. Renee Calloway, would become closely associated with the discovery in the years that followed. Calloway had spent 20 years working on sites connected to the history of free and enslaved Black Americans in the Northeast, and she brought to the Manhattan Passage a combination of technical expertise and historical context that proved essential in interpreting what the physical evidence actually meant. It was Calloway who first identified the tool marks in the chamber walls as consistent with the masonry techniques documented in Whitfield's commercial work. It was Calloway who recognized the significance of the raised wooden platform, not just as a practical measure against moisture, but as evidence of what she called intentional dignity, the deliberate decision of a builder who was thinking about the human experience of the people who would use the space. And it was Calloway who, working with a paper conservator from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, oversaw the painstaking extraction and stabilization of the documents in the tin box. The tin box itself was a discovery within a discovery. It had been placed in a cavity in the chamber wall, a cavity that had been specifically cut for it, its edges too clean and deliberate to be accidental, sealed with a thin layer of mortar that had preserved the interior remarkably well against the moisture that had degraded so much else in the passage. The placement of the box suggested that whoever had put it there had intended it to survive. Not necessarily to be found, there is no note inside addressed to a future reader, no declaration of purpose, no explanation of what the documents mean or why they were preserved. But the care with which the cavity had been prepared, the quality of the tin, the layer of wax that had been applied to the interior of the lid before it was closed, all of it spoke to an intention of permanence. Someone had decided that these particular pieces of paper mattered enough to protect, and had protected them with the same methodical care that characterized everything else about the passage.
The paper conservator who worked on the documents described the experience of opening the tin box as one of the most memorable moments of her professional career. The lid had corroded shut and required careful chemical treatment before it could be opened without damaging the contents. When it finally yielded, slowly, with a sound she described as less a creak than a sigh, the documents inside were folded exactly as they had been placed.
the paper darkened with age but structurally intact, the pencil marks of Thomas's journal still legible under magnification, Whitfield's list still clear enough to be read with the naked eye. The wax seal that had been applied to Whitfield's folded list had cracked but held its shape, and when the conservator photographed it under raking light, the impression of a simple tool, the head of a carpenter's nail, pressed into the wax as a seal, was clearly visible. A carpenter's nail. Not a signet ring, not an official seal, not any of the marks of institutional authority that history tends to preserve and celebrate. A nail. The most ordinary tool of the most ordinary trade, pressed into wax by a man who was doing something extraordinary with the simplest means available to him. Calloway, when she saw the photograph, said that she sat with it for a long time before she could continue working. The documents were fully transcribed and published in a joint report by Columbia University and the Landmarks Preservation Commission in 2019, accompanied by high-resolution photographs and a detailed analysis of the paper, ink, and pencil composition that confirmed the dating to the early 1830s with a high degree of confidence. The report ran to nearly 400 pages and was written in the careful, hedged language of academic scholarship, full of phrases like consistent with and strongly suggests and cannot be definitively established. But beneath the scholarly caution, the picture that emerged was clear enough. A free black carpenter in Lower Manhattan had spent years building a secret passage beneath his house. He had used it to shelter 17 people fleeing slavery over 9 months in 1832. He had kept a list of their names, and one of the people he had sheltered had kept a journal of what it felt like to be hidden underground, waiting for the world above to become safe enough to rejoin. The publication of the report generated significant media attention, and that attention brought something that the researchers had not anticipated: responses from members of the public who believed they might be descended from people on Whitfield's list. Over the 2 years following publication, the Columbia research team received more than 200 such inquiries. Most could not be substantiated. The combination of changed names, incomplete records, and the deliberate obscuring of origins that characterized the post-escape lives of freedom seekers made definitive genealogical connections nearly impossible to establish. But 11 of the inquiries produced enough documentary overlap to be considered seriously, and 3 of them resulted in connections that the researchers were willing to describe, with appropriate qualification, as probable. One of those 3 was a woman named Sandra Okafor, a retired schoolteacher from Brooklyn whose family had preserved an oral history across 6 generations, a story passed down from grandmother to granddaughter about an ancestor who had hidden in a stone room beneath a carpenter's house in New York City in the winter of a year when the city was sick with a great disease, and who had been sheltered there by a man whose kindness the family had never forgotten and whose name they had never known. Sandra Okafor had heard this story from her grandmother. Her grandmother had heard it from hers. The chain of transmission stretched back, in the family's telling, to a woman who had lived through it herself, a woman whose name, in the family's oral tradition, was given simply as May. May does not appear on Whitfield's list by that name, but the 9th entry on the list, dated August 1832, at the height of the cholera epidemic, when the northern network had been disrupted and the timing of the entire operation had been thrown into chaos, is annotated with a notation different from all the others. Where most entries have a single letter or a brief word, the 9th entry has 3 lines of Whitfield's small, precise handwriting. Woman, alone, from Georgia, remained 14 days, spoke of a daughter left behind, continued north, God willing. 14 days, the longest stay recorded on the list. The cholera epidemic had disrupted the network at precisely the wrong moment, and the woman Whitfield he had simply recorded as woman alone from Georgia had spent 2 weeks in the underground chamber, while Whitfield worked frantically to re-establish the contacts that would allow her to move. 14 days of lamp flame and muffled city sounds, and the particular weight of a silence full of everything she was trying not to think about. 14 days of food passed down through the access point in the floor, and footsteps overhead, and the sustained, exhausting performance of normalcy from the man above. And a daughter left behind in Georgia, whose name Whitfield did not record, whose face the woman in the chamber carried with her into the dark, and whose existence echoes across 6 generations to a retired schoolteacher in Brooklyn who grew up hearing a story about a stone room and a carpenter's kindness, and who sat in a Columbia University conference room in 2020 and read a 14-word notation and recognized in its spare and careful language the outline of her own family's history. Sandra Okafor told the researchers when she had finished reading the entry that she did not have words for what she was feeling. Then she said something that the lead researcher, Dr. Calloway, would quote in every public lecture she gave about the discovery in the years that followed. She said, "He wrote her down. After everything, he wrote her down. She wasn't lost."
There is a particular kind of reckoning that a city undergoes when it discovers that its past is more complicated than its monuments suggest. New York has never been short of monuments. The bronze generals on their stone horses, the plaques on the sides of buildings commemorating the birthplaces of the famous and the sites of the significant, the carefully curated narratives of a city that has always preferred to think of itself as a place of arrival and possibility, rather than a place of complicity and compromise. These monuments are not lies exactly, but they are selections. They are the results of choices made by people with the power to decide what gets remembered and what gets quietly absorbed into the foundations and forgotten. The discovery of Whitfield's Passage was, among other things, a confrontation with the cost of those choices, a physical, undeniable demonstration that what gets built into the foundations does not stay there forever, and that the city's relationship with its own history is not something that can be managed indefinitely by simply pouring new concrete over the old floor. The public response to the discovery was, in its broad outlines, what you might expect: a wave of media attention, a period of civic reflection, a series of official statements from city and state officials about the importance of preserving and honoring this history. The passage was designated a landmark. Plans were announced for a memorial and interpretive center on the site. Schools incorporated the story into their curricula. For several months in 2017 and 2018, the discovery occupied a genuine place in the public conversation about New York's history and about the history of race in America more broadly, and that conversation was, in many respects, serious and worthwhile and overdue. But there was another layer to the public response, quieter, less institutional, more personal, that researchers and journalists who followed the story closely came to regard as perhaps its most significant dimension. It was the response of the descendants, not just the 3 probable descendants identified through the Columbia research process, but the much larger and more diffuse community of people across the country and beyond who heard the story of Whitfield's Passage and recognized in it something that belonged to them, not genealogically necessarily, but historically, culturally, in the deep sense in which a community's history belongs to all of its members, regardless of direct lineage. For many Black Americans, the story of the Underground Railroad is not distant history in the way that, say, the Roman Empire is distant history. It is recent history. It is the history of great-great-grandparents and the stories they told their children, and the stories those children told their children. It is history that arrives not through textbooks, but through kitchens and front porches, and the specific, irreplaceable texture of family memory. And what the discovery of Whitfield's Passage offered to people who carried that kind of history was something that the official record had never quite managed to provide: physical evidence, tangible, unmistakable, archaeologically verified proof that the stories were true, that the stone rooms existed, that the people who hid in them were real and specific, and worthy of the same detailed, careful attention that history typically reserves for the people who held power. Dr. Calloway spoke about this dimension of the discovery in a lecture she gave at the Schonberg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem in 2018, and her words were recorded and widely shared in the months that followed. She said that in her 20 years of working on sites connected to African American history, she had learned that there were 2 kinds of historical evidence: the kind that tells you what happened, and the kind that tells you that it happened. The first kind fills in details. The second kind does something more fundamental. It confirms. It validates. It says to the people who have been carrying a story in their family memory for generations, "You were right to remember this. It was real. He wrote her down."
The phrase, "he wrote her down," had, by the time of Calloway's Schomburg lecture, already taken on a life of its own beyond the specific context of Sandra Okafor's response to the 9th entry on Whitfield's list. It had appeared in newspaper editorials and social media posts and the titles of 2 academic papers published in the year following the discovery. It had been used by a poet whose work responding to the discovery was published in a literary journal and read aloud at a ceremony marking the passage's landmark designation. It had become, in the compressed and powerful way that certain phrases sometimes do, a shorthand for something much larger than its literal meaning, a way of talking about the radical act of documentation in a context where documentation was itself a form of resistance, where writing a name down was a declaration that the person bearing that name was a person, fully and completely, regardless of what the law said about their status. Because this is the other thing that Whitfield's list represents, beyond its value as a historical document. It represents a refusal. In 1832, the legal and social architecture of the United States was constructed around the premise that the people on that list were not fully people. They were property. They were chattel. They were items to be listed in inventories and assessed for value and bought and sold and reclaimed when they escaped. The entire apparatus of the Fugitive Slave Act, the entire infrastructure of slave catching and legal enforcement that made Whitfield's work so dangerous, rested on this premise. And Whitfield, in his small, neat handwriting, on a piece of paper that he sealed in a tin box and placed in the wall of a hidden chamber, refused it. He wrote their names. He recorded the dates of their arrivals and departures. He noted the woman who stayed 14 days and spoke of a daughter left behind. He noted the woman who traveled with child. He kept a record that treated the people passing through his passage as exactly what they were, individuals, with specific histories and specific circumstances and specific claims on the attention and care of anyone who encountered them. That record survived, against all probability, against the erosion of nearly 2 centuries, against the concrete that was poured over the floor, and the 7 subsequent owners who had no idea what they were living above. The record survived. And when it finally came back into the light, it did what Whitfield had perhaps hoped it might do, in whatever portion of his thinking extended beyond the immediate urgency of keeping people alive and moving them north. It made them impossible to forget. The interpretive center that opened on the site in 2022, 5 years after the initial discovery, was designed by an architect who had spent months studying the physical dimensions and material qualities of the passage before drawing a single line. The design that emerged was deliberately understated, a ground-level structure of modest height, its exterior clad in stone that echoed the hand-cut material of the chamber walls, its interior organized around a central corridor that replicated in its dimensions and proportions the 60-foot length of the original tunnel. Visitors entering the center walk the length of that corridor before reaching the interpretive galleries, and the corridor is designed to produce, in a controlled and intentional way, something of the sensory experience of the original passage, the narrowing of space, the lowering of ambient light, the shift from the noise of the street to a quiet that is not empty but full. At the end of the corridor, before the galleries open out, there is a wall. On the wall are 17 names. Not the cryptic notations of Whitfield's list, not the single letters and brief words that served their necessary purpose of concealment, but full names, reconstructed where possible through the research process, and where reconstruction was impossible, replaced with the word that Whitfield himself had used in his letter to describe the people who came to him. Where a name could not be recovered, the wall reads simply, "The Weary." 17 entries, some names, some not, all of them written down. Sandra Okafor attended the opening ceremony of the Interpretive Center in the spring of 2022. She was asked to speak, and she accepted, and she stood in the corridor that replicated the dimensions of the tunnel where her ancestor had waited for 14 days in the summer of 1832. And she said something that the people who were there have described in the years since as the moment the ceremony became something more than a ceremony. She said that her grandmother used to tell her that the most important thing a person could do for the dead was to say their names out loud. She said she had spent a long time thinking about that, about what it meant to say a name out loud, about what a name does when it is spoken in the presence of people who are listening. And then she turned to the wall and she read all 17 entries, slowly, in the quiet of the corridor, and the people standing around her listened. The last entry on the wall, the 17th name, dated October 14, 1832, the final entry on Whitfield's list, could not be recovered. The notation beside it in the original document is too faded to be legible, the paper at that point in the list having sustained more moisture damage than the rest. The name, if there was a name, is gone. What the wall says in that final entry, in the same lettering as all the others, is simply "The Weary." When Sandra Okafor reached that entry, she paused. She stood in silence for a moment that the people present have described as lasting much longer than it actually did, the way certain silences expand to contain something larger than their clock time. And then she said quietly, to the wall, and to the name that was not there, and to the person it represented, who had passed through a stone tunnel in the fall of 1832, and continued north and disappeared into the vast incomplete archive of a history that was never adequately recorded. "We know you were here."
The history of the Underground Railroad has always existed in a complicated relationship with evidence. This is not accidental. The entire operational logic of the network, the reason it functioned, the reason it survived as long as it did, the reason the people who ran it were not all arrested and imprisoned within the first year of their activity, was built on the systematic destruction and avoidance of documentation. You did not write down the names of the people you were sheltering. You did not keep records of the routes you used. You did not correspond with your contacts in language that could be understood by anyone who intercepted the letter. The Underground Railroad survived because the people who operated it understood, with a clarity born of mortal necessity, that paper was dangerous, that ink was dangerous, that the impulse to record, so natural to human beings, so fundamental to the way communities preserve and transmit their experience, was, in their specific circumstances, a potential death sentence. This means that the historical record of the Underground Railroad is, by design, full of holes, not because the history didn't happen. It happened abundantly across decades and thousands of miles, and the lives of an estimated 100,000 people who used its routes to reach freedom. But because the people who made it happen were operating in conditions that made documentation actively hazardous, the archive that survives is fragmentary in ways that no amount of subsequent scholarship can entirely repair. We have the accounts that were written after the fact, when safety made writing possible, the published narratives of freedom seekers, the retrospective memoirs of conductors and station masters, the oral histories collected by abolitionists, and later by researchers and journalists. These are invaluable, but they are not the same as contemporary documentation. They are memory rather than record, and memory, however precise and honest, is subject to the erosions and reconstructions that time and distance inevitably produce. What makes Whitfield's passage extraordinary in this context is not just what it contained, but what it represents as a category of evidence. It is contemporary documentation. It is a record made at the time by someone who was inside the experience rather than looking back at it, in the specific and irreplaceable language of the immediate. Thomas's journal was not written 30 years later by a man trying to reconstruct what it had felt like to be hidden underground in 1832. It was written underground in 1832 by a man who was living it. The fear in it is not remembered fear, it is present tense fear, set down in pencil on folded paper by a hand that was perhaps not entirely steady, in a stone chamber beneath a city that was simultaneously his refuge and his trap. This distinction matters enormously to historians, and it matters in ways that extend beyond the purely academic. Contemporary documentation is persuasion in a way that retrospective account can never quite be. It closes the distance between the past and the present in a way that even the most vivid and precise memory cannot fully achieve. When you read Thomas's journal, you are not reading about an experience. You are, in some essential sense, inside it. The lamp flame, the footsteps, the silence full of everything he was trying not to think about, these are not descriptions of things that have already happened and been processed and converted into narrative. They are things happening, on the page, in the present tense of the writing, and that present tense reaches across nearly 2 centuries and pulls you in.
This is, of course, what the best history always does. Not just inform, but immerse. Not just tell, but make present. And it is what the discovery of Whitfield's passage achieved in the public consciousness more effectively than any amount of scholarly argumentation could have done. People who had never thought deeply about the Underground Railroad, people for whom it had been a chapter in a textbook rather than a living reality, found themselves confronted with a stone room and a tin box and a journal written by a man who did not know if his family was alive. And they found that the distance they had assumed existed between themselves and that history was not as large as they had thought. The schools that incorporated the story into their curricula reported something that teachers found both moving and instructive, that students who had previously engaged with Underground Railroad history as a collection of facts to be memorized responded to the Whitfield passage story with a qualitatively different kind of attention. A social studies teacher at a middle school in the Bronx described showing her class photographs of the passage and the tin box and the documents, and watching the moment when a 12-year-old girl in the front row looked at the photograph of Thomas's journal and said in a voice that was not performing emotion but simply registering it, "He was scared." Not, "They must have been scared." Not the detached third-person analysis of someone engaging with historical material at a safe remove. He was scared. Present tense, immediate, personal. That shift from the third person to the present tense,
from the historical to the immediate, is what physical evidence accomplishes that no amount of written narrative can fully replicate. And it is why the preservation of sites like Whitfield's Passage matters in ways that go beyond the academic and the archival, into something closer to the civic and the moral. A society that can stand in a corridor that replicates the dimensions of a hidden tunnel, that can read 17 names on a wall and understand what those names represent, that can hear a retired schoolteacher say, "We know you were here," and feel the weight of what those words are carrying. That society is engaging with its history in a fundamentally different way than a society that encounters the same history only as text on a page. The question of what we owe the past is one that every generation has to answer for itself, and there are no clean or universal answers. But the discovery of Whitfield's Passage offers at least one concrete and specific contribution to that ongoing negotiation. It makes the past harder to abstract. It makes it harder to reduce the history of slavery and resistance to statistics and timelines, and the kind of broad narrative sweep that allows a comfortable distance to develop between the reader and the reality. It puts a face, or rather it puts a hand, a specific hand holding a pencil in a stone room in 1832, on a history that has too often been encountered at the level of the general rather than the particular. Dr. Calloway, in the years since the discovery, has spoken frequently about what she calls the pedagogy of the specific, the idea that historical understanding deepens not when we grasp larger patterns, but when we engage with individual cases in all their irreducible particularity. The general fact that the Underground Railroad existed and that people used it to escape slavery is important, but it is a different kind of important from the specific fact that a man named Thomas spent 11 days in a stone room beneath a Manhattan brownstone in February of 1832 and wrote, on the 7th day, a single sentence about not knowing if the people he loved were alive. The general fact gives you knowledge. The specific fact gives you something closer to understanding. And understanding, Calloway argues, is what changes behavior, not just the behavior of individuals in their private lives, but the collective behavior of societies in their public ones. This argument has particular resonance in the context of New York City's relationship with its own history. The city has, over the past several decades, made genuine and significant efforts to acknowledge and memorialize aspects of its past that were previously obscured or ignored. The African burial ground in Lower Manhattan, discovered in 1991 and now a national monument, being perhaps the most significant example. The Whitfield Passage joins that tradition and extends it, adding to the physical landscape of the city a site that speaks specifically to the history of resistance, not just to the history of suffering, which is essential and must be acknowledged, but to the history of people who looked at an unjust system and decided to act against it, at enormous personal risk, with the tools and materials available to them. That history of resistance is, if anything, more urgent as a subject of public memory than the history of suffering alone. Because suffering, however real and however important to acknowledge, is passive. It is something that happens to people. Resistance is active. It is something that people do. And a city that memorializes only the suffering of its marginal communities without equally memorializing their resistance is telling an incomplete story, a story that implicitly positions those communities as the objects of history rather than its agents. Whitfield's Passage corrects that imbalance, at least in this one specific instance. It is a monument not to what was done to people, but to what people did. It is a monument to a frightened man who decided that fear was insufficient reason to do nothing, and who spent years building, in the dark and in secret, and at the risk of everything he had, a place where the weary could rest without fear of the morning. The morning, in this context, is not a metaphor. It is the specific, literal morning that a person in that stone chamber would have had to face, the moment when the lamp was extinguished and the food was passed down through the access point in the floor, and the footsteps resumed above, and the city went back to its business of being indifferent and dangerous. That morning, when you had to still be hidden, still be silent, still trust in the man above whose aim you might not know and whose face you might never see clearly. That morning, repeated for 11 days or 14 days, or however many days the network required before the route north was clear, is what the passage was built to make survivable. And it did. 17 times, it did.
There is a question that sits at the center of this story that has not yet been asked directly, and it is time to ask it. Why did Whitfield keep the list? This is not a question with an obvious answer. Everything else about the way he operated, the concealment of the passage, the coded language of his correspondence, the deliberate performance of normalcy that allowed him to move through the city without attracting suspicion, was oriented toward the elimination of evidence. He was a man who understood, with complete clarity, that documentation was dangerous.
and yet he kept a list. He wrote down 17 names. He sealed them in a tin box and placed the box in the wall of the chamber and left it there when he sealed the passage and left the city. He did not destroy it. He did not take it with him. He left it behind, hidden but preserved, in a way that seems, the more you think about it, the more certain this seems, deliberate. The question of why has occupied researchers since the list was first transcribed and published. Several explanations have been proposed, each with its own logic and its own limitations. The most practically minded explanation is that the list served an operational purpose, that it was a record kept for coordination with the northern end of the network, a way of tracking who had been moved and when, so that the chain of handoffs that constituted the route to Canada could be managed without the kind of miscommunication that might leave someone stranded or exposed. This explanation is plausible, but it doesn't quite account for the detail of the notations. The 3 lines about the woman from Georgia who stayed 14 days and spoke of a daughter left behind, the notation about Clara traveling with child. Operational records don't typically include that level of human specificity. Operational records record what happened. Whitfield's list records who it happened to. The second explanation is psychological, that the list was a private reckoning, a way for Whitfield to manage the weight of what he was doing by giving it a concrete, countable form. 17 names, 17 people who had come through the passage and continued north, and were, as far as Whitfield could know, alive and moving toward freedom. In a life defined by uncertainty, by the constant low-grade terror of discovery, by the impossibility of ever knowing for certain whether the people he helped had reached safety, the list may have served as a form of accounting, a record of the specific, finite, countable good that had been accomplished against the backdrop of a wrong so vast and so systemic that no individual action could meaningfully address it in its entirety. You cannot end slavery by building a passage beneath your house, but you can move 17 people through it. You can write down their names. You can count them. The third explanation is the one that researchers find most compelling, and it is also the most uncomfortable, because it requires acknowledging that Whitfield may have kept the list knowing that it might someday be found by people who were not him, and that he may have kept it for them, not for a specific person, not for a named recipient, but for the indeterminate future, for whatever version of the world might eventually exist in which the list could be read without danger, in which the names on it could be spoken aloud without consequences, in which the people it documented could be recognized for what they were, rather than classified as what the law said they were. This explanation requires attributing to Whitfield a kind of historical consciousness, an awareness that he was living through a moment that future people would want to understand, and a decision to contribute to that understanding despite the risks involved in doing so. Is that attribution too much? Is it projecting on a man who left too little record to justify such a specific claim about his intentions? Perhaps. The honest answer is that we cannot know. The tin box does not come with an explanation of why it was placed in the wall. The list does not include a cover letter addressed to the future. We are, as always with the Underground Railroad, working at the edge of what the evidence can support, in the territory where historical inference shades into something closer to imaginative reconstruction. But there is one piece of evidence that tilts, at least slightly, toward the third explanation, and it is the most deliberately placed piece of evidence in the entire archive.
The phrase carved into the stone of the far wall of the chamber, "The Lord will provide passage." It is the phrase that the demolition worker saw when he raised his flashlight in the spring of 2017, the phrase that changed everything, the phrase that turned a routine demolition job into one of the most significant historical discoveries in recent New York City history. It is a biblical reference, a variation on the phrase spoken by Abraham in the book of Genesis, in the moment when he is about to sacrifice his son, and his son asks where the offering is. The Lord will provide. In the original context, it is a statement of faith made in the face of the incomprehensible, a declaration that meaning and purpose are present even in situations where they cannot be seen or understood. In Whitfield's passage, carved into stone with the same tools that built the chamber around it, it is all of that, and something more. It is also, researchers have noted, a statement that makes no sense as a purely private inscription.
If you carve something into the wall of a space that you intend to seal and never revisit, you are not carving it for yourself, you are carving it for whoever comes next. Whitefield carved that phrase into the stone of the far wall of the chamber, knowing, he must have known, that the chamber would be sealed after the last person passed through it, that the passage would be closed, that the inscription would be in the dark for however long it took for someone to open the passage again. He carved it for the future reader. He carved it for Derek Torres, standing in the dust with a flashlight, 200 years later. He carved it for everyone who would stand in the reconstructed corridor of the interpretive center and feel the weight of the space and try to understand what had happened in it. He was writing to us, not with the confidence of a man who knew his message would be received, but with the faith, the precise biblical faith of the phrase he chose, that passage would be provided, that the tunnel would eventually open, that the words would reach someone. The Lord will provide passage. He was talking about the people moving through the chamber. He was also talking about himself, sealed in his frightened double life above the floor. And he was talking, in whatever portion of his thinking extended into the future, about the message itself, about the possibility that what he had built and what he had recorded and what he had carved into stone in the dark would someday find its way to people who needed to know it had existed. That faith was not misplaced. It took 185 years, but the passage was provided. The concrete broke, the light came in, the tin box held, Thomas's journal survived, the list survived, the phrase on the wall survived, and the story that Whitefield could not tell openly, in the city he had to leave and the life he had to abandon, was finally told, not in the hushed and coded language of the activist network, not in the careful, hedged language of the historical archive, but in the full light of a public reckoning that the city had been deferring for nearly 2 centuries. Sandra Okafor, in the speech she gave at the Interpretive Center opening, said something else that has stayed with the people who heard it. After she read the 17 entries on the wall, after the silence that expanded to contain something larger than its clock time, she turned back to the audience and she said that she used to think that history was something that happened to your ancestors and then was over, that it was past, in the full and final sense of that word, finished, sealed, inaccessible, except through documents and photographs and the diminishing chain of family memory. She said the passage had changed that understanding for her, not because it made the past present, she was careful about that, careful not to claim more than the evidence supported, but because it demonstrated that the past was never as sealed as it appeared, that things buried deep enough to be forgotten were not the same as things destroyed, that the difference between lost and hidden was sometimes just a concrete floor and the right moment and someone willing to break through. She said, the passage was always there, we just had to find it. And that perhaps is the most important thing this discovery offers to a city and a country still negotiating their relationship with a history that is uncomfortable and incomplete and resistant to the kind of clean resolution that monuments and ceremonies and interpretive centers can only partially provide. Not closure. There is no closure available for what the history of slavery represents, and to offer closure would be to trivialize it, but something more honest and more useful than closure. The knowledge that what was buried is findable, that what was hidden can be brought to light, that the names written down in the dark by a frightened man who decided that fear was insufficient reason to do nothing can be read aloud in a corridor that replicates the dimensions of his tunnel by a woman whose ancestor slept on his floor in a city that is slowly, imperfectly, necessarily, learning to say out loud the names it spent so long pretending not to know.
What do we do with a story like this? Not in the institutional sense. The Landmarks Commission has answered that question. The Interpretive Center has answered that question. The academic papers and the school curricula and the ceremony on the site have all in their different ways answered that question. But in the personal sense, in the sense of what a single person sitting with this story is supposed to carry away from it and into the ordinary texture of their life, that is a harder question, and it is the one that feels most worth attempting to answer as we reach the end of this particular passage through the history of another. The easy answer is inspiration. Amos Whitefield was brave, the story goes, and his bravery should inspire us to bravery in our own circumstances, whatever those circumstances might be. This is not a wrong answer, it is simply insufficient. Inspiration is a feeling, and feelings are temporary, and the history of human beings being briefly inspired by examples of courage and then returning to their ordinary habits of caution and self-interest is long enough and well documented enough that inspiration alone seems like an inadequate response to what Whitefield built and what Thomas recorded and what Clara encoded in the name of her son. The harder answer, the answer that the physical specificity of the passage seems to demand, the answer that a stone room and a tin box and a list of 17 names pushes you toward if you sit with them long enough, is something closer to obligation. Not the vague, generalized obligation that comes from acknowledging that bad things happened in history and that we should try to do better. Something more specific than that. The obligation that comes from understanding that the people on Whitefield's list were not abstractions. They were specific human beings who moved through a specific underground space in a specific city and continued north and built specific lives in specific places and named their children and told their stories to their children and passed those stories down through generations that eventually produced people who are alive right now, today, in this city and in this country, carrying histories that the official record spent a very long time refusing to confirm. That specificity is a demand. It demands that we resist the comfortable abstraction that turns history into lesson rather than reality. It demands that we hold the particularity of Thomas's journal, the lamp, the footsteps, the single sentence about not knowing if the people he loved were alive, in the same part of our attention where we hold things that are immediate and real and consequential. It demands that we understand Whitefield's list not as a historical artifact, but as a record of a debt, not a debt that can be repaid, because some debts are beyond repayment, but a debt that can be acknowledged. And that acknowledgement is not nothing. Acknowledgement is in fact everything. It is the difference between a history that is known and a history that is owned, between information and responsibility.
The city that poured concrete over the passage in the mid-20th century was not, in all likelihood, a city that knew what it was covering. But it was a city that had stopped looking. And the willingness to stop looking, to accept the concrete floor as the final word on what lies beneath, to let the momentum of development and progress and the perpetual forward motion of a city that has always preferred its future to its past override the slower, more demanding work of attending to what has been buried, that willingness is not innocent. It is a choice, made in aggregate, made collectively, made by thousands of individual decisions to not ask the question, not lift the floor, not wonder what the building has been holding all this time. The demolition crew that broke through that floor in 2017 was not trying to find anything. They were doing their jobs, but the concrete broke, and the light went in, and what was there was found. And what was found changed things. Not everything, not in the sweeping and immediate way that crisis changes things, but in the slower, deeper way that genuine understanding changes things, by making certain kinds of forgetting no longer available. You cannot unfind a passage. You cannot unread a list of 17 names. You cannot stand in a corridor that replicates the dimensions of a hidden tunnel and then go back to believing that the city you live in has no secrets worth attending to, no floors worth examining, no foundations that might be holding something that deserves to come back into the light. This is what Whitefield left us, not just the passage, not just the list, not just the phrase carved into the stone of the far wall. He left us the knowledge that the impulse to document, to write down, to record, to seal in a tin box and place in a wall, is itself an act of resistance. That bearing witness, even in secret, even in the dark, even with no certainty that the witness will ever be received, is something worth doing. That a name written down is a name that cannot be entirely erased. That the weary who rest without fear of the morning are owed the permanent acknowledgement of their weariness and their courage and their continuation. He was a frightened man who decided that fear was insufficient reason to do nothing,
He built a passage. He sheltered 17 people. He kept a list. He carved a phrase into stone. He sealed it all in the dark and left the city and disappeared into the incomplete archive of a history that was never adequately recorded. And he trusted, in the specific, biblical, unguaranteed way that trust operates when there is no certainty available, that what he had built would someday provide passage to something larger than itself. It did. The passage was always there. We just had to find it. And now that we have found it, the only adequate response is to do what Whitefield did, in the best way available to us, in the specific circumstances of our own moment. To write down the names, to keep the list, to carve into whatever stone is available to us the declaration that the weary were here, that they mattered, that they continued, and that we, standing in the light they could not access, are the proof that the passage was provided. The Lord will provide passage. He did. They made it. And after nearly 200 years of silence beneath the streets of Manhattan, so finally have we.